Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you. Great to be here again, and another great day in Atlanta with Cody. Cody, how are you today?
I'm doing well.
Beautiful.
We're off to a strong start. It's fall. I guess It's fall. I don't even know when technically summer ends. But
I think September 21st.
Oh,
so we're close.
Yeah,
we're close. We're within 9 days or whatever of it.
Yeah. Well, scratch that then. But today we've got a little bit of time, so we want to get into this book. By your dad, Max King, which if you don't know who the author is, we spent the last podcast
unexpectedly for me.
Unexpectedly for you, but talking about your dad, the author of this book. But this book just released. It's called Irrevocable. You can pick it up where?
Through Presence. You got to come through Presence until, I believe it's October 1st when the publisher is going to release it to Amazon. And we're working with their sales team as far as getting it in bookstores as well. But right now, if you want a copy of Irrevocable, you just go to the Presence website and you can order that right off the website.
And I'm holding it in my hand. It's working title, or the title is Irrevocable, and then the subtitle is Paul's Radical Vision in Romans 9 through 11 and Why Christianity Can't Handle It.
Yeah. So
this book is about Romans 9 through 11.
Yes.
Okay, Doug King. Who cares?
Yeah. Well, I think that's every podcaster's question, isn't it? It's like, well, we're going to do a podcast. Who cares? Well, I think the people that care are, you've always got people that care because they want to be able to keep an eye out for the latest heresy and the latest person who is apostate and leading those astray. And certainly Dad's work will be called that by many of those people, which is fine. I understand that. I would have done the same thing earlier in my life when I was not holding these same views and so forth. So I get that. I understand that. So does Dad. And so do you. And we're all okay with that. We know how that works. But there are a number of people out there, especially a lot of pastors, that are trying to bring their faith groups, their collectives, what's been known as the church, forward into more and more inclusive realms of thinking. And this inclusiveness thing, let's face it, I mean, it's the big kicker right now, Cody. Women in authority, where should they be, and LGBTQ, and so on and so forth. So who should care about this podcast? Anyone that is interested in the evolution of God inclusiveness.
Okay. I want to give the people a bit of a trajectory of where we're headed, or at least where we think we're headed. So this podcast will talk a little bit about the context, who is Paul writing to? Is Paul writing? Is he the author? And then who's he writing to, and what's going on, and the Jews and the Gentiles, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll spend a couple of podcasts doing all of that. And then at some point, we are going to flip into Romans 9 through 11 and talk about the trajectory of what actually is happening there. And probably go into some, not necessarily verse by verse, but we'll definitely go into some of those verses, which is what your dad does in the book. Would you say it's not a commentary?
Right.
But he definitely takes on a lot of the verses.
Yeah, I mean, he does an exegesis of 9 through 11, but he doesn't do it necessarily orderly in the verses. He's trying to, again, get to the structure of the thought, not just in 9 through 11, but how it fits in the rest of the book of Romans. And then, as we'll see as we continue to talk, he's also putting it in the context of, and this is why Paul said this in Galatians, that may appear to be opposite of what he's saying in Romans. So yeah, he takes the sections, the different sections, but he does cover 9, 10, and 11. And that's what we're going to do as well.
Okay. So these first couple episodes, we're going to give you not only the context, but we're also going to give you a little bit of a summary of the entire book. Then we'll get into it and start working our way through it. So, Doug, real fast, can you help us a little bit with the context? Because I know I want to talk about how your dad opens this book with a discussion of like the theological differences about what Paul was trying to say. But before we even get there, who is Paul writing to here? What for any like person that just picks up the book of Romans?
Sure.
What is happening? What is going on? What is he addressing? As I read it, there's certainly a lot in there about the collective of both the Jews and the Gentiles.
Oh, yeah.
And there's obviously some fighting or something going on. And I don't even mean, as I understand it, not Jews per se like Judaism, but like Jews that were following Jesus per se. And then the Gentiles who had been, obviously there's a big issue about Gentile inclusion. And these Gentiles and Jews were back at each other. And it's as if Paul, as I understand it, is specifically addressing those two groups of people in Rome.
Yes. And so if you go back to Paul's own claim or description of himself, he clearly describes himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul had a particular role and function, and that was to speak to the Gentiles. And that's why his ministry was different than Peter, James, and John, who were in Jerusalem. And again, Peter, James, and John were in Jerusalem operating in an isolated field where they were attempting, Cody, to bring the people in Judaism out of Judaism and into this next phase, whereas Paul started with the Gentiles who were never in that to begin with. So Paul's mission was to make sure the Gentiles were not converted by some of the Judaizers to use circumcision and keep the law, because they'd never been in it. And the reason it was tolerated in Jerusalem was because that was their way of life. And Peter and James and those guys were actually weaning them away from the idea that those were requirements. The requirements of the law is a phrase often used in the narrative. So that's why Paul was talking to Gentiles. Now, all these cities, it didn't matter where you went, in Galatia, Rome, Ephesus, Corinth, these new collectives were made up of Jew and Gentile. And Paul oftentimes would start teaching in the synagogues and whatever when he went to these cities. But make no mistake, his primary focus was to get this message out to the Gentiles.
And it's also important to note that Paul was a Jew.
Yes.
And this is written, most theologians say it's written around early spring of 57 AD. So that puts us in a timetable. So we're post the Jesus thing in the cross.
Oh, yeah.
But we're pre end of the age, destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
And obviously, if you know anything about the narrative, you know about Paul's conversion experience. I use that phrase, but it's the idea of when the scales fell from his eyes, which to me is a beautiful picture of enlightenment. It's a beautiful picture of the evolution of human consciousness. But Paul, who thought he was a man that was defending God and doing the thing God had called him to do, realized that in the name of God, he was actually opposing the new thing that God was actually doing.
Yeah. And so Paul, again, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised when people vehemently disagree with us. Paul holds himself up as the poster child for that by saying, hey, we'll get into the text later, but basically that's who I was. So much so that I went around persecuting. And of course, he was there when the martyr Stephen was stoned to death. So yeah, that was his background. And it really isn't until you read Romans, and we'll get into it later, that you realize why God chose Saul of Tarsus to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Why didn't he go get Luke, who was a Gentile to begin with, to be the main guy speaking to the Gentiles? There's a reason, and Paul actually uses the reason that he was brought to the Gentiles as the core of his argument in Romans 9 through 11. So we'll get to that.
Okay. Before we even jump into my next question, what do you say, Doug, to those that have angst towards Paul? So there has been, at least in the theological world, a real movement of jettisoning the teachings of Paul because of things like 1 Timothy 2, women, 1 Corinthians, women, the way it was interpreted homosexuality, things like that. What would you say to those that are listening to this podcast and are like, man, I really love your integral stuff, but I don't know, Paul, really? Like for many, Paul is a thousands of year old man who is out of step with 2019. And how could Paul be integral in the least bit when he was misogynistic and he was clearly promoting slavery? You talk about a very early stage consciousness guy. It seems and appears on the surface level that that's where Paul was.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to study these integral models. That's a great example, Cody, of why the integral models are so important, because we know that when you have an integral perspective, you have not jettisoned all the first tier levels. You have simply detached from being in any one of them exclusively. So when you have an integral perspective, you're able to realize this is the way the archaic works, the tribal, the warrior, et cetera, and I am all of those levels. I'm all of them. And so when you are in particular settings, if you're in a blue setting, which Paul was in that day and time, there are some blue settings where women were to keep silent, or women were to dress in a certain particular way. And actually, if you go to countries today, say in the Middle East, that are red, warrior, blue, traditional red, blue, you know that in certain countries, if you're going to go and you go with your spouse, a head covering should be worn. And you do that out of respect, not because you're saying as a man, look, everybody, I'm telling my wife to wear a head covering. What you're doing is you're taking an integral approach to each specific life condition. And so as Paul looked at what was going to fit the life condition and the expectations of a culture at that particular time, that's why he would take a view on the one hand that seemed like he was anti-women or authoritarian in essence. But what gets confusing is when he turns around and says, yes, in Christ there's neither male nor female, and that identity actually transcends male and female, and it's not about being a male. So that's when integral begins to really make sense, right?
Yeah, and again, you have a lot of folks that proof text, but the idea is at a larger picture, you do get a greater perspective maybe of what Paul was actually doing, because again, Romans 16 is a perfect example of this, but he talks about all these women who, Junius and Phoebe and on the list goes. So it's clear that when he's writing in one area about women, and then you see this, that was a particular place at a particular time.
That's it.
So you would say for those that are on edge, even going with us on this journey with Irrevocable, you would say, hang on with us, because do you think Paul had an integral perspective?
Absolutely. And I think as we go through this fall series, we'll see that Romans was actually that necessary writing of his that led to the ultimate understanding of integral. And that, like all things, look, the spiral, you can't jump from blue meme to integral, or from orange meme to integral. You got to go through all the stages. Well, what we'll see is that Paul went through particular stages in earlier writings, like with the Galatians, where he was emphasizing things that pertain to the earlier primary basic views. And it isn't until you get to Romans that he's then set the groundwork where he can explain the rest of the story and how it all fits together and how it makes sense. How he can say, for example, in Galatians, that the bondwoman and her son are cast out. You think, okay, that's the end of the story. But then he's going to address casting out in Romans 9 through 11, and it's going to appear that he's saying something different. He's not, because he's integral, and what he's doing is what the whole narrative does, and that is tell us about God and reveal the God nature and the God identity that we all have, but it has to be revealed level by level, stage by stage, in order for me to understand it in its totality.
So written in 57 AD, he was a Jew himself, but he had a ministry to the Gentiles. We obviously see there's a conflict here between Gentiles and Jews. Paul is specifically writing a letter to these particular groups of people in the city of Rome. Rome, obviously, of which was like the capital, the epicenter of that particular world at that particular time. You think about the Roman Empire, this global military superpower, which sits right in there, which makes sense when you start reading even past 9 through 11, you get into 13. which is about the authorities and submitting to authorities and things like that. So there's a lot going on. And as we methodically walk through this particular 9 through 11, we'll start to make sense in greater nuance and detail of exactly what Paul is addressing here, because it's actually, there's a reason you use the idea of Paul's radical vision.
Yes.
Because it's like, even as I got back into it, I realized, God, if it's radical now still.
Right. You can only imagine what it was like in the first century.
Yeah.
And again, you can get quickly reminded of the radical nature of it when you read about how he goes into a city and he's stoned, dragged outside the city gates and left for dead. Usually when people do that to you at a conference, they're thinking that what you're saying is fairly radical. And I would say to all those who oftentimes email, how do I get somebody in my family to see this? How do I get a spouse, a relative to see this? You don't. You can have the conversations if they present themselves or if the other person's willing to have the conversation. But again, Paul understood that you're going to get resistance. And this is the whole cross event where Jesus, being nailed to a cross, understands they know not what they do. It was a consciousness level that those people were on that led them to that act of crucifixion. And Jesus, because he had that integral knowledge of God, his Father, was able to say, I understand why they're doing it. You obviously don't agree with it, but you can simply say, I understand why you're doing what you're doing, but I don't agree with it.
So Max opens the book. When I first cracked it open, I actually sent you a text because I was like, dang.
Yeah.
I was like, Max is coming on strong on a load of different theologians.
Sure.
So I like to begin there. Irrevocable, okay. This book tends to begin with a discussion of a myriad of theological differences.
Yes.
For those that just hang with us, if you don't nerd out on this kind of stuff, you may lose you, but just hang with us. But there are, when you think about Romans, I think it's important for us to begin here because years and years of work has been done on this very complex book. In fact, some would say Romans is the most complex book in the narrative.
Yeah. Yes.
And there have been lots of people. So are we saying that we finally figured it out?
That'll be the first criticism. I know. Well, again, in this last podcast we had a week ago, we were talking about me running off to college with his first book. And the first criticism that I got was, who in the world does your dad think he is? Oh, I see. After all these centuries, this dad of yours, who basically, they didn't say this out loud, but I know you know what you could have said. This dad of yours that graduated from high school in West Virginia, oh, I see. He is going to now correct our denominational view of this. Oh, yeah, right. I get that, and I understand why you would think that. I think, though, that's not the point. You know, to me, the point is not who the messenger is. It wasn't the point to Dad. I think this is why Dad is going to die in solitude, if you will, from the standpoint of fame and, you know, there won't be a sculpture or a bust anywhere, because that just seems to be the way Spirit works. Mm-hmm. And Dad knew that all along. And so that's not even the question. The question is, we're going to look at the text. We're going to ask ourselves, what's been the history of the evolution of your thought? You, the listener, we'll talk about that. What are the ways in which your thought has evolved? Are you okay with your own evolution of thought? And if you are, is there any reason why we should be afraid to talk about what further evolution there could be?
So this isn't the perspective. That's not what we're saying. This is a perspective.
Yes.
And we happen to believe, as best as we can, that we believe this is in what we call an integral framework of this particular passage of Scripture.
Exactly. And years from now, evolution will continue. And people will chuckle at some of the things that I think or that my dad wrote in another century, 2 centuries, whatever. And I know the critics will say, well, I'm doing that right now. But what I'm saying is that all of us have to realize we're just like everybody else in history. We're doing the best we can with what we've got. And the point of Romans 9 through 11 is, thank God I'm not accepted on the basis of making sure that I've met some set of understanding requirements in order for my father to say that I'm accepted. So yeah, this is his perspective. This is his contribution. Time will tell whether or not these paradigms that we're presenting are going to make sense to people or whether they'll just fade away.
So what are some of the theological differences?
Well, of course, because you have so many different denominations. And by the way, I would say when you're talking about all these different theological differences, Cody, it should remind all of us that we have had a temptation in the past to use the term Christianity as though Christianity is one thing. Or people will say, when it comes to these theological differences, they'll use the term, what about the church? There is no such thing as Christianity per se. There are only thousands of iterations and perceptions about what Christianity is or should be. There is no such thing as the church. There are only thousands of iterations and perceptions of what the church is or is not. Some of them are going to be blue, some of them orange, and some of them green. If you don't know what we're talking about, those podcasts have already been posted online over the last year, and they're basically traditional, modern, and postmodern ways of interpreting the same story. So when Dad is criticizing the theologians that are in this particular work, he's talking about theologians that come from all different kinds of perspectives. They may be Calvinists, they may be Arminian, free choice, they may be Catholic, they may be Protestant, they may be part of 1,000 different denominational chains that have evolved through time, and many of which still exist today. And therefore, what he's trying to do is he's trying to get a broad overview of what all of the different denominations have been struggling with. Because once you read some of the quotes that he has in the book directly from these people and their books, you quickly see that they were all struggling with what to do with Paul in Romans 9 through 11. So it's all over the board, to answer your question, as far as the authors. And there's quite a bibliography in this book. So when you look at the bibliography, it'll give you a real good range of the different quotes that you'll find there.
Yeah, you gave an example of, we were talking earlier about a puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah. I thought it was really helpful, even as we attempt to frame where we're headed. Can you share that with our listeners?
Yeah. Kids, for those of you that have little ones or have had little ones, you start them out with these puzzles that maybe have like 10 pieces in them. They're just, where a little one can put a puzzle together. And there's just not that many pieces, maybe even less than that. And when they're first starting to put these puzzles together, if they find a piece of the puzzle where they can connect it to the puzzle anywhere, they'll push that piece in there. And then if it's not where it's actually supposed to go, as they try to build the puzzle, the other pieces don't really fit. But what they'll inevitably do, instead of taking the puzzle apart and trying to go back to where they got off base, they'll just take the piece they have and push hard as they can push, hoping they can make it fit. And they push as hard as they can to try to make that piece fit in the puzzle. And you have to give them some guidance and show them, hey, no, you're going to have to take that apart back to the place where we got off base here. And so I don't think we should be surprised. And for people that get upset and say, oh, wait a minute, off base, what are you talking about? Just remember, whatever group you go to today, it is a product of people who have come before and who disagreed with previous views that led to groups that evolved, changed, and finally morphed into the group you go to right now. This is the process of evolution. And so when we're trying to say, Cody, Christianity, now what view, what flavor? When you're trying to say church, wait a minute, what view, what flavor? Because there is great division in all of that. And that's reflected in these theological writers who have great division. And the next question is, why were these problems created to begin with? And of course, that's where we begin to get more into the text.
I love that. I think I heard one author talk about how we've been handed the wrong lid to the puzzle. And so it's like we're trying to put these pieces together. And many of us, when we do a puzzle, you look up at the actual picture and we've just been given the wrong picture. So imagine there being a different box cover and you're trying to make sense of the pieces you have, but it doesn't even match the box cover that you've been given.
Right.
And so when we set out on this, we mentioned all that to say there are a myriad of views and perspectives of what we're about to read, and they're stacked on top of each other, deep in the history of theological thought.
Yes.
And your dad mentions a lot of them.
Yes.
One of the, can I read?
Sure, please, go ahead.
I'm going to read periodically through this.
All right.
I was sitting out by the pool because my wife's like, you're supposed to be reading a beach book. And I'm like sitting out by the pool reading Max King's book. But he mentioned, he talks a lot about N.T. Wright.
Yes, has great respect for N.T. Wright, has actually been to Westminster when N.T. Wright was over there and met with N.T. Wright personally. So he has lot. Yes, he's actually met N.T. Wright, and he has a lot of respect for N.T., as he does all these writers. It's not that he disrespects them.
Yes.
Look, people, especially in later views of postmodernism, can confuse disagreement and criticism of someone's view as an outright denouncement of that person's character. No, it's just a disagreement of viewpoints.
Yeah, and not to derail us too much.
Yeah.
You can only do that when you're detached from your beliefs.
Yes,
yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
So an example of that is, and that's what the point that I'm trying to make is as we begin this, is we are critiquing other views while simultaneously presenting a new or a different view. And the point is we just want to contribute to the greater work that's already been done from people like an N.T. Wright. And an example of that, I love, I text you this one because I thought it was so great, but your dad talks about C.H. Dodd, which I don't know who C.H. Dodd is.
Yeah, he's from the past.
Okay.
So he's not, you're not going to find C.H. Dodd on a current conference tour.
He's from the past. That's actually
he's
a great statement.
Name from the past.
Okay. I love this. He said, he was talking about Dodd's perspective or whatever. He said, Dodd apparently never entertained a need to question his understanding. This is page 18, by the way. Dodd apparently never entertained a need to question his understanding of chapters 1 through 8, and understanding that he could not tie in with Paul's teachings in chapters 9 through 11. Instead, Dodd believed that Paul was, quote, caught napping, quote, in those chapters. And then this is great. Is your dad's throwing shade? Listen to this. Evidently, someone has been, quote, caught napping, but it is unlikely that it's Paul.
Now,
That's the pastor's way to throw shade.
For those of us like you and me that come out of really structured blue meme Christianity, that is absolutely... we live for those kinds of things in those days, right? Especially, the days where it's like, okay, I want to debate you. Let's have a debate. Let's you get your team, I'll get my team. They cheer for me, I'll cheer. They cheer for you, and blah blah blah. And let's use all these catchphrases and blah blah blah. But yeah, we like those things.
I had an image of C.H. Dodd and your dad sitting up, and it's just a pastor's way. And honestly, it shows that your dad's like witty. Like, it's just like, that's pretty brilliant. But the point is he is, you can look at his bibliography and you can tell when we step into this conversation, it is on top of a lot of work that's already been done.
And a lot of the pastors that we meet with will say it's just that the people in my group, when they go to Christian bookstores, they just get books that reinforce our particular historical view on something. They're not reading from all the other views that are out there. They're just reading books that reinforce our particular niche, our particular thing. And this is why this book is so important to me, is that it's attempting to take into account primary views, one right after the other.
So if you're interested in what those are, that's in the beginning part of the book, is he takes on. So and what's really helpful for me as I read it is I see Max's angle on things, but then he's also presenting a host of other theologians in how they have interpreted Romans 9 through 11. And as we get into this, we'll be able to see that a big part of these interpretations lie in how we see eschatology,
Yep.
Because that determines a lot of how we even interpret what Paul is even talking about here.
Yeah, it's one of the first and earliest pieces of that 10-part puzzle that we're talking about. And if you put it in the wrong place, Schweitzer, Boltzmann, and others put their finger right on it years ago, you got some real problems. And we'll talk about that later on in the series.
All right. Thanks for joining us today. We'll catch you next week and jump into part 3 of Irrevocable.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.